What led you down this path of investigating into the addictive properties of food?
Well, it's a little crazy. If you go back far enough, 2008, I was in Algeria interviewing Islamic militants when a couple of FBI agents showed up at the New York Times headquarters in New York looking for me. I'd been traveling to Iraq, tormenting the Pentagon for failing to equip American soldiers with armor, and then I was kind of writing critically about the war on terrorism. According to the FBI, I had managed to land myself on an Al-Qaeda hit list. I actually think it was the Algerian government trying to get rid of me. But at any rate, the New York Times editor ordered me home that night. And I came back and I was looking for something different, safer maybe, to do. And my editor spotted this outbreak of salmonella in peanuts being manufactured in Georgia on the Alabama border. And I went down and took a look, and it was like this window on this trillion-dollar processed food industry that had lost control over its food chain because they were using these peanuts in dozens and dozens of other products, but they didn't even know it. And so there was like this rolling recall that went on for weeks as people were getting sick all over the country. And then I was kind of writing about E. coli in hamburger, which was having the same problem, when one of my best sources who tests meat for the food industry said, look, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination are, you really should look at the stuff my industry is intentionally adding to its products, over which it has absolute control. And he was concerned about all the salt in processed meat, but that led me to look at sugar and fat. And so the first book I wrote, came out in 2013, was looking at salt, sugar, fat as this unholy trinity, if you will, that on which the food industry relies to get us, hooked on its products. But then I kind of realized that there was more to it than just the additives. And so I looked at this question of whether there isn't something about these products that so many of us seem to be dependent on that would kind of qualify them as true addictive substances like smoking and alcohol and narcotics.
Yeah, we the three of us here were trainers in the fitness industry for 2 decades, and we often talk about the addictive properties of food. We saw it firsthand with our clients, but sometimes we get pushback from people saying things like, food can't be addictive. You don't see people, selling their bodies for sugar like they would for cocaine or whatever.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence do you have that food, or what did you find in terms of the addictive qualities of food, and is it comparable to drugs?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I was one of those people 5 years ago pushing back on you, right? Like, where were the armed robberies, and how come not everybody loses control, even of eating junk food like some people do? And where are the harsh chemicals, right, in these foods that you find in drugs? So here's what I found, and we can just kind of walk through those things. One, people aren't robbing the 7-Eleven for Oreo cookies because they're so cheap, almost anybody can afford these kinds of foods. And that's one of the things that attracts us to them. They don't have to have harsh chemicals because our brain naturally makes chemicals like the famous dopamine that attract us to things, whether it's heroin or Hot Pockets and Lunchables. And then finally, by definition, addiction is something that happens on a spectrum. There are casual smokers of cigarettes. There are moderate drinkers. There are people, and I would never suggest this just because of the contamination issue for nothing else, but there are casual users of heroin, right? Which kind of explains or sort of gets to that question. And the big pushback from the industry is like, why doesn't everybody lose control? So what I found with Hook, though, is kind of beyond kind of the additives and their ability to use kind of synergistically perfect formulations of salt, sugar, fat, they're tapping into our basic instincts that by nature draw us toward food and overeating, but they've changed the nature of our food in the last 50 years so dramatically that overeating has become like this everyday thing. So like one of my scientists said to me, look, Michael, it's not so much that we're addicted to food, it's that these companies have changed the definition of food in a way that our biology and our genetics hasn't had a chance to catch up. So we have this mismatch.
Michael, I'm old enough to remember when, fat was public enemy number one, right? We were all told to avoid eating fat. It's the reason why we're so obese. And then I remember when it changed and became carbohydrates and you should avoid carbs. And that's the reason why we're so obese. And I remember in my later years as a trainer looking at the prevalence of heavily processed foods in our diets, and I matched it with a chart on obesity, and they seemed to match up perfectly. And now we have studies that show that when people consume lots of heavily processed foods, they naturally consume 500 to 600 more calories a day. What are they doing in these foods? Because heavily processed just means that they're adding things and changing things. What are they doing to these foods to make them, essentially hijack our systems of satiety or make us want to eat so much more?
Yeah, so one of the hallmarks of addiction is speed. The faster a substance hits the brain, the more seductive that substance is and the more apt we are to act compulsively as a result. So like cigarette smoke can take about 10 seconds to kind of fully activate the brain. Alcohol, narcotics are somewhat less than that, but still just a few seconds. Well, it turns out nothing is faster than salt, sugar, fat, and some of these hyper-processed foods and their ability to reach the brain. Because again, they're using our natural hard wiring that has made us be attracted to food because food is life or death, or it certainly used to be for our forebears, right? And so they did these incredible experiments where they sat people down and go like, okay, we want to measure how fast you taste sugar. So they'll put some sugar in, and when you taste sugar, push this button. So they put a little sugar on people's tongues, picked up by the taste bud, the sweet receptor within the taste bud, which then sends that signal to the reward part of the brain, the part of the brain people call go, that gets us to do things, to act, run from danger, or eat, or fornicate, as scientists say, right? Have more babies, the kind of really essential things that keep us alive. Well, those people were pushing the button, tasting sweet, in 0.7 of a second. Same with salt. Fat can reach the brain as well. So speed, and really for me, that kind of put the whole term fast food in a new light. I mean, I like to call these foods I write about fast groceries, because that's kind of what the processed food industry is all about in making these hyper-processed foods. Everything about it is fast. From the manufacturing to reduce the price of the products, because that's one of the things that attracts us to food, to the packaging, so we can open it up really quickly and get that kind of immediate satisfaction and yumminess, to the speed that the ingredients in those products actually are able to sort of hit the brain and cause it to go and want more.
Talk about how, I heard you talk about how when you actually, there's some foods that are manufactured to dissolve really quickly to where it kind of hijacks satiety, right?
Oh yeah. So, Cheetos, right? Sort of the puffed snacks that you put in your mouth and you kind of gently press your tongue to the roof of the mouth. And what do? They melt, because the magic formula in snack products is like 50% of the calories coming from oils and fats, because that creates what the industry calls the mouthfeel, right? It's that sensation of biting into a toasted cheese sandwich. And you can probably tell I'm more of a salt than a fat guy myself, because my brain is like lighting up just thinking about that toasted sandwich, right? But so the industry discovered, and they have a great term for this, that when that puffed snack, Cheeto, what have you, dissolves in your mouth, the brain gets the wrong idea that the calories have disappeared as well. And so you might as well eat that whole bag of Cheetos, because you're not getting any calories, right? They're gone. You have to love the language that the industry uses to kind of describe the science of its products and its efforts to maximize the allure. But speaking of calories, that's another way that the food industry has been exploiting our natural attraction to food. So we evolved to like foods that have the most calories in them. Makes sense, right? I mean, calories is fuel, which is life or death. And even putting on body fat, right, was a really good thing for most of our existence. It enabled the brain to grow. us to get through hard times, to have more babies, which is the most important thing, right, evolutionarily. And we have sensors in the gut, possibly in the mouth too, that tell us how many calories there are in what we're eating or drinking. Scientists can do this really amazing experiment using a sugar called maltodextrin, which is actually kind of found as a miracle ingredient in a lot of processed foods, because it's a sugar, but for most people it doesn't taste sweet, and yet it has a bunch of calories in it. So they can use it for like adding texture and bulk, the things that they don't want to sweeten too much, right? But you do an experiment where you have a glass of plain water and a glass of water with maltodextrin in it. You can't see the difference, taste the difference, feel the difference, but time and again, sort of in experiments, people will choose the maltodextrin. They will like that more than the plain water because the gut and the brain is sensing the calories. And so what did the industry do? They created this phenom of these calorie-packed products, right? That are empty calories, but the brain and the gut can't tell the difference between empty and good calories, good for us calories. And so we end up eating a whole day's worth of calories in like a bag of snacks, again, in the way that we don't have the biological tools to sort of put the foot down and say, wait a minute, this is like not a good thing to do.
When you look at some of these massive companies that produce these processed foods, how much money or how much of their resources goes to this research and development that goes into the science of what you're talking about? Is it a big part of their money? Is this a big part of what they do?
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, the margins, it's $1 trillion industry, maybe $1.5 trillion if you include fast food restaurants, right? The margins of profits, though, can be kind of surprisingly thin. And I was surprised to learn they're incredibly risk averse, right? A lot of what these big food companies do is let mom and pop shops sort of experiment and put out new products. They wait and see if there's any chance for success, and then they buy those up. And you see this going on all the time. These are like conglomerates buying smaller companies when they have successful products. And they're actually shy of taking risks. So a lot of what you see in the grocery store, I mean, when's the last time they actually invented anything kind of truly new, like, I don't know, microwave popcorn or Lunchables or something? It actually doesn't happen that often. What they tend to do is change the color or the name or the texture a little bit or the size of the packaging, or they just kind of splash the word new on the front of the package and we think it's new. But it's really not. I mean, that said, though, they have working for them bench chemists, psychologists, marketing experts, who 24/7 are working on maximizing the allure of their products in any way they can, whether it's the additives you can see on the label or whether there's these other kind of instinctual things we've been talking about that attract us to food generally.
Can you go a little more in depth on a lot of the terminology and what they use for marketing these types of products?
For marketing, well, internally when they're talking about maximizing the allure, they hate the A word, addiction, right, more than anything. But they talk about engineering their products to have craveability, snackability. One of my favorite terms is more-ishness, right? These are not like English majors. These are like as I said, bench chemists and marketing people who are just kind of like expressing themselves, just talking to one another about their efforts to maximize. But the language kind of goes on and on. I mean, it's really the internal language that they use, I think, that is kind of like so descriptive and so enlightening as to their efforts. Salt they call the flavor burst because it's typically on the outside of their snack products and the first thing that touches the tongue. Fats, I mentioned to you, to them, fats are the mouth feel. It's that sensation, right? Picked up by the trigeminal nerve that goes up to the brain as well. Sugar, they call the bliss point. Just to give you one example of the effort they put into things, a gentleman who created some of the biggest icons in the grocery store, his name is Howard Moskowitz. He was trained in high math and then experimental psychology at Harvard, walked me through his recent creation of a new flavor for Dr. Soda, in which he started with no less than 60 versions of a syrupy flavor vehicle, if you will, as it calls it. Each one just kind of like slightly different from the next one. Subjected those to, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 consumer taste tests around the country, and then took the data and threw it in his computer and did his like high math regression analysis thing, and sort of out came these bell-shaped curves that kind of like kids get graded on in school. But at the top of the curve is not the dreaded middle C. It's the perfect amount of sweetness, right? Not too little, not too much. It was Howard who coined the term the bliss point to describe that perfect amount of sweetness. But here's the thing. When you talk to nutritionists, the problem isn't that people like Howard helped the industry engineer bliss points for things like soda and cookies and ice cream. The companies marched around the store adding sugar to things that didn't used to be sweet before, so that bread got added sugar and a bliss point for sweetness. Some yogurts came to have as much sugar per serving as ice cream. Pasta sauce, right? I've talked about how some of the brands had the equivalent of a couple of Oreo cookies with sweetness in it. Tiny half-cup serving of spaghetti sauce. And so what happened, I should say, is that it created this expectancy in us that everything should taste sweet. And so when you, and by the way, almost everything is, by one estimate, 2/3 of the products in the grocery store now have added sugar. And so when you drag yourself over to the produce aisle, right? That poor little part of the store that nutritionists tell us we should be spending more time in filling up half of our plate with vegetables. And you get those other flavors, tastes that Aristotle wrote about, right? Like bitter and sour. Your brain is like rebelling, going like, where's the sweetness? Take me back to the center part of the store.
Talk a little bit more about that. So all three of us are fathers, and I have a 1.5-year-old right now. And one of my biggest concerns is what you just said right now, that 2/3 of the grocery store has got added sugars to it. And I know Gerber baby food has got sugar in it already. And so
yeah.
I imagine that when you introduce things like that to a baby already, you're going to increase the craveability, or the what did you
sure.
the terms they use?
Their liking of sugar, and the same with salt. And look, I confess, I mean, I raised 2 boys. At one point, I caught them in the pizzeria licking the salt shaker. I mean, we're not. So, just an example: we're not born liking salt. We don't develop a taste for salt until maybe like 6 months of age. And salt is like this miracle ingredient for the processed food company. They're using it not just for flavor, but for texture and solubility, and as a preservative, and kind of on and on and on. That's why like 3/4 of the salt in our diet is coming from them, not from the salt shaker. But kind of the point of that is that, kind of through habit. Oh, I should mention too, and there was this great study done by some scientists who actually do some work for the food industry, where they looked at 2 groups of kids, and some kids were raised on like whole foods, cooked at home, right? And then another group, processed foods. And guess who was, like my oldest son, more apt to be licking the salt shaker by the time they were in elementary school? It was that the group raised on processed food, because the nature of processed food was dictating to those kids what they should value in food. And in that case, it was salty food. In other cases, it's sugary food. So what they eat at a really young age, and possibly even still in the womb, depending on what their mother has been eating, is a big determinant in sort of shaping their likes and dislikes. Which kind of raises the whole memory things. I mean, one of the ways that I argue that food is more trouble for us than cigarettes, drinking, and drugs is that we start forming memories for food at a really young age. And we often associate those memories with, a beautiful, great time in our life. And that's why the food companies spend so much time advertising, marketing to us when we're young. And that's why you go to a ballpark with your kids. They're doing everything they can to put a soda in their hands, but knowing that at that joyous moment, that soda will forevermore be associated with that joyous moment. So when the kid grows up and they want a little joy or comfort in their life, boom, they're thinking of that soda.
This leads me to this next question, Michael. We're talking about the addictive properties of these foods and how they're being manipulated to make them even more addictive. And one of the characteristics of addictive properties is this kind of, you build up a tolerance. For example, caffeine is a very commonly used substance. It's got addictive properties. I know when I first use caffeine, 100 milligrams gives me a nice buzz, but if I use it every day, I need 200 milligrams. Next time I need 300 milligrams. Do we see that with food? In other words, do we see that with processed foods where you eat them and at first it's like, oh, that's a little overwhelming, but then the more I eat, the more I need to get that same feeling?
We do see this, and I think generally the answer is kind of no, not in the way that some drugs do that. And in fact, because drugs, we discovered, act differently, scientists who kind of define addiction dropped the tolerance sort of thing as a factor, as they dropped withdrawal, because there are some like heavy narcotics that you can use that don't create withdrawal pains, right? Like you imagine if you sort of envision a heroin junkie trying to stop heroin and just sort of having to like tie him or herself to the bed, for days on end in severe pain, right? That's no longer a criteria for calling a substance addictive. But what is kind of similar in kind of the same vein is that there's kind of a difference between wanting and liking. And what scientists who kind of study people in brain scan machines while they're eating or looking at pictures of food, they kind of discovered that when you get cravings for this food, the wanting goes up, but the liking doesn't necessarily go up. It can even go down. It's like we want this stuff and then we eat it and it's okay, but it's really the wanting that drives our actions and sort of the compulsive eating. And that can change over time. Speaking of scientists, there's this great guy, he's now at Stanford, Eric Stice, who did the first kind of longitudinal study looking at how people respond to food, both looking at pictures of food, how the brain responds, both looking at pictures of food and then actually tasting it, because he picked up on this really cool way, because normally you're in the fMRI, you can't chew, it blurs the images, but he pumps in this fabulous Haagen-Dazs milkshake that he makes for people and drips it on their tongue through a plastic tube, and so can watch the brain kind of respond to that. But what he noticed for the first time, and I think this is so important to understand our vulnerability and why we're so exposed and why this 42% obesity rate is so important and tragic, is that as people put on weight, body fat I'm talking about, excess body fat, their sensitivity to cues, as psychologists call it, pictures of food, taste of food, increases. They want the food more than they did before when they had less body fat, which is incredible. And I didn't really understand that until I spent some time with scientists who were like starting to look at body fat. And it turns out body fat is this incredible organ that's thinking, communicating with the rest of the body, and frankly being really devious, because its one mission in life is to protect itself from any effort on your part to sort of get rid of it. So if you're like trying to like diet to lose weight, your body fat is sending a signal to the brain telling you you're hungry, or hungrier than you should be or were before you had that body fat. And it's also slowing down your resting metabolism so that you're less of a threat to it because you're burning less energy just like sitting around or sleeping.
Wow, that is incredibly fascinating. Now, this makes me think of the characteristics of the behaviors that I would notice in clients when they would consume these processed foods. You mentioned the wanting more than the liking, and I even for myself, like I would say the food that the processed food for me that really is the most challenging is potato chips. And I notice when I eat them, it's more about the chip that's in my hand than about the chip that's in my mouth. It's like I want to get more in my mouth. And it's not necessarily that I'm enjoying the flavor, but rather I want the next one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. Although speaking of potato chips, I have some of my favorites here, of course. And you notice the bag is like somebody's been into these. But, and I usually bring these out to talk about like that flavor burst of the salt that's on the surface and and the 50% sort of fat oil from calories for the mouthfeel, right? Even these kind of melt in your mouth. They also, the noise that food products make is really critical because they've discovered that the more noise a potato chip makes, the more apt we are to eat more chips, right? And what I didn't know too until spending time with nutritionists is that potato chips are kind of loaded with sugar in the sense that the refined sort of potato starch gets converted into sugar in our body actually kind of fairly quickly. So it's got that trifecta of salt, sugar, fat. I mean, for me though, I mean, we're all different, right? Addiction happens on a spectrum. Our trouble with food happens on a spectrum. I mean, I'm one of those people who can reach into a bag of potato chips and eat a handful and close the bag up and put it away and not feel compelled to eat the whole bag in one sitting or even pull it out later in the day. And I like to think that I still sort of want it and like it. But we're all different, and we're all vulnerable in different ways at different times of the day. And I would eat this right now, except I'll make a lot of noise.
Do you think that's because it's more psychological for the individual, and just like we use drugs to medicate for something else that we want to be distracted from?
Oh,
do you think that's
so
do you think that's
I
the
talk
reason?
to people. Yeah, no. When you talk to sort of drug addiction experts, I think the really smart ones out there are looking for that underlying cause. They're basically, asking the client, why are you taking this substance? And really why? I mean, what's going on there? And there have been some studies looking at trauma, whether it's spousal abuse or sexual abuse. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that can cause people to turn to substances, again, whether it's alcohol or drugs or food, as sort of the antidote to that. And it goes back to sort of these deep memories in us too, which associate eating with comfort. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for comfort in response to trauma in your life, it's only sort of natural that you might turn to food as that solution.
And it's so much more socially acceptable, right? So I think that's part of the issue, right? If someone's walking around with a bag of chips, we don't think it's a big deal. But if you saw him walking around with a bag of cocaine or heroin, you would think it's a big deal, right? So I think that has
there's a guy in Philadelphia who's been working on trying to find solutions to our loss of control with food for decades now, and he sort of said to me once that, Michael, it seems like almost there was a day overnight in the 1980s when it became acceptable socially to eat anything, anywhere, anytime. And that's like when you started seeing people walking down the street eating or going to business meetings with food. Or, I mean, you wouldn't be surprised if I pulled out a Lunchables now and started snacking. Well, maybe you'd be surprised by that. But in other Zoom meetings, maybe not, right? So, and parents stop telling their kids, don't snack between meals. And so today, snacking, and it's mostly these junk snacks that do nothing for our health, and if anything makes things worse, it's become like the fourth American meal. We're getting on average now, I think it's like 550 calories per person per day from snacking, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the French think we're insane to do something that would, at all diminish the joy of one of the most fabulous moments of the day when you can sit down with family and have a home-cooked meal and conversation and linger. I mean, to do something that might ruin your appetite for dinner is like nutso. But in this country, so many families aren't even having dinner together. They're grazing kind of all day long, or they're just, they're grabbing their dinner on the go separately, individually, or they're watching TV while they're eating dinner distractedly, which can also cause you to overeat.
Yeah, although we are now seeing that most modern nations are starting to follow our lead. I know we were the leaders in obesity by a long shot. Now we're starting to see these other countries start to creep up. And I even Mexico, for example, was a few decades ago, didn't have an obesity epidemic, and now it's exploding with the introduction of a lot of these foods. Are we seeing this just grow everywhere as countries adopt more of this kind of modern Western, I guess, lifestyle?
Yeah, I think so. They followed the game plan of tobacco industry, because when tobacco industry was pursued in courts and had to settle that huge case with state attorneys general back in the late 90s, the tobacco industry was already moving overseas into countries where people were paying less attention, knowing that their marketing dollars were better spent there. And big food has done the same as more and more of us care about what we put in our bodies and change how we value food and think of it less as instant gratification and yumminess and more as like fuel for strength and our brains. These companies have moved over to their marketing to other countries. I think they started more with like emerging places like Brazil with emerging middle classes that again hadn't thought about processed food, weren't aware of the hidden costs in convenience foods, but also European Union. It's like they're all over the place now, including France, because people are facing the same kinds of stresses and changes in social norms there as they were here, earlier.
Now, you've had a lot of experience going in and meeting with a lot of these CEOs and companies, and I know you've said before too that you don't demonize them or blame them. They're doing what they're supposed to. They're a company trying to make money. But have you ran into some of these owners and founders feeling guilty for what has happened and maybe changing sides or changing their mind on how they want to do things?
Yeah, no, I was really lucky. I mean, as you know, with Salt, Sugar, Fat, the first book, I came across this trove of documents that put me inside the companies and their memos and emails and white strategy papers and marketing plans. And it was those documents that enabled me to identify people who invented, many of these products, like the Lunchables, and to get to meet and talk to the former president of Coca-Cola for North America. And I was struck by two things. One, how many of them don't eat their own products because they know better and they're worried about losing control, or they're worried about the health effects, right? But two, how many of them sort of came to have misgivings about their life work. And they could kind of argue that, look, we invented these things in a more innocent era, 1970s maybe, before everyone became so dependent on them. We didn't mean for people to eat Lunchables every day or Hot Pockets to make that your dinner, et cetera, right? And they could kind of excuse that. But seeing our dependence grow, they can't. Not only have they come to have misgivings, but some of them have switched sides. I mean, the former president of Coca-Cola went to work for a carrot farm and began selling baby carrots with the same kind of cunning that Coke was selling soda to kids, right? Not preaching about carrots, but kind of like selling them as fun, as excitement, which is like a really interesting concept. The inventor of the Lunchables began working with a guy who invented fresh salad to sell out of vending machines. And actually, you can find him at O'Hare Airport now, to help him think about kind of some marketing strategies that worked really well for Lunchables, but can also work for good food.
What are some of the other factors that they manipulate to make these foods so irresistible? I mean, we mentioned salt, sugar, fat. You said mouthfeel,
sound.
Is it like
dissolve
the bag?
Yeah,
color?
so yeah. You're hitting a lot on color. We get really excited by color. I realized this most when the first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, had come out, and I was at the New York Times newsroom, and this guy from Silicon Valley called me up. He said, "Hey, I want to come visit. I'm concerned." So he came in and he had the book, and he had underlined a sentence in every paragraph. I thought, wow, you're really interested in the food, aren't you? And he goes, no, I'm interested in helping people, curb their addiction to smartphones. And what the tech industry does is almost in parallel with what the food industry does. And he was the first person who told me that, if you toggle the switch on your iPhone to turn it into black and white, your brain almost goes to sleep. It gets much less excited, rather, over any of its functions or the apps. I mean, you're going I paid that much money for this piece of junk. I don't even want to use it. It's really incredible how color gets us excited. And the same thing is true with foods too. That's why when you go grocery shopping, it's like burst of bright neon colors. I mean, that gets excited. But yeah, let's go back to the basic instincts, right? So we by nature love food that's cheap. In the old days, that meant less energy expenditure of our part. You can imagine being in a hunter-gatherer society, it made a lot more sense, instead of running down that antelope for dinner, just grabbing that aardvark, that's poor thing that's sitting there, right? And have that. And so what do the food companies do? They have these chemical laboratories working for them. They're called flavor houses. They mimic the flavors in sort of the natural world in order to enable the processed food industry to make their products. They came up with things like the pumpkin pie spice, right, that you see in a lot of products in the fall, from like candy to Pop-Tarts to cereal, what have you. But the main thing, using, by the way, as many as 80 ingredients to make that pumpkin pie spice, I discovered when I spent some time at one of these flavor houses. But their overarching goal is to mix and match those ingredients, those additives, to reduce the cost. Because these companies know that we'll get incredibly excited by a box of breakfast pastries that like cost 10 cents less than it did the week before. Again, as a basic instinct of ours. We're drawn by nature to variety, because, you know, our forebears realized through natural selection that if we ate lots of different things, right, we were more apt to get all of the nutrients we needed to thrive and be healthy and what have you. And also we became really good at eating lots of different food, because climate used to change in the past, and it would dramatically change our food source, and we would have to adjust to it. And humans became really good at adjusting to lots of food and being able to fall in love with lots of different foods. That's why people could move or emigrate to the Arctic and fall in love with whale blubber, right? So what happens in the grocery store? You walk in the cereal aisle and there are 200 versions of sugary starch, right? The companies knowing that will get us excited, sort of our natural attraction to variety. And then we talked about calories, which is probably the most significant thing, that their most significant instinct of ours that they're exploiting to sell their products and put us in this biological mismatch.
Now, I've seen over the years how fortification of minerals and nutrients and things and all these products have just basically entered into every single food item, it seems like. Is this an effort on their part to try and then inject these nutrients back into the foods as they've been manipulating them so they have the
You
taste
have to
and
share
feel?
your Kellogg story for this one. I've heard you tell about the first time you bit into the Kellogg's without the sodium. Yeah.
Oh, right. So it you know, at one point I was looking at salt in particular, and I went to the biggest companies and said, like, what's the deal here? I mean, salt has become like this public enemy number one, because we seem to be eating too much of it, and associations with high blood pressure, heart disease. Like, why are you using so much salt? And they said, and one of them, Kellogg, said, hey, come on in. And they didn't just talk to me, they prepared for me special versions of their products without using any salt at all, right? They thought they were going to show me. And they did, because it was the most god-awful eating experience I ever had, right? We started with the Cheetos. The Cheez-Its, which normally I could sort of eat day in and day out, right? But the ones that they made for me without salt, we couldn't even swallow them. They stuck to the roof of our mouth, because salt adds texture and solubility. We moved on to the cornflakes. The frozen waffles were next. And with the ones without salt came out looking and tasting like straw, because salt does add some flavor and then color. And then the clincher were the cornflakes. Put them in a bowl, threw in some milk, took a bite, and before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman for the company was sitting there in this laboratory, and she swallowed and burst out, metal! I taste metal, metal. And I kind of go, yeah, I thought one of my fillings fell out. It was like sloshing around in metal fillings, right? It's like sloshing around in my mouth. And the chief technical officer for the company, right, who's in charge of like all things scientific, he's kind of started chuckling and goes, yeah, not everybody will taste the metal in saltless cornflakes. And look, I didn't even know cornflakes had salt in them. But he said one of the beautiful things about salt for us is that it will cover up some of the off notes, bad tastes that are inherent to some processed foods, which explains sort of why they see salt and a lot of these other additives as these miracle ingredients that they're not all there to wow your go brain. A lot of them are there just to keep like the the machinery from getting sticky in these factories making the food, or as a preservative so they can stay in the warehouse for 6 months without rotting, or going stale, and on and on. So a lot of these additives are functional things for the industry, and not necessarily things we should be concerned about, except kind of overall when you ask the question, like, what is this stuff?
You brought up the tobacco industry a couple times, and then you very quickly mentioned the tech industry with phones and apps, and of course now we're talking about processed foods. Do we see a lot of carryover? In other words, do we see people moving from one industry to the other? So, like, for example, does a food company hire people from big tobacco because they're so good at making their products so addictive, or vice versa? And are we seeing them now move to tech to kind of figure out those things?
Oh yeah. So yes. So one of the things I discovered for the first book, and I touch on a little bit in Hooked, is that for the longest time, Philip Morris was also the biggest single producer of processed food in North America, because it bought, back in the 80s, the old company General Foods, which used to be here in New York, up in Tarrytown, and then Kraft, and then Nabisco. And in that case, it was kind of the tobacco managers, guiding the food managers on how to sell their products in the grocery store and in convenience stores, where cigarettes had a lot of their sales. Oddly enough, over time, starting in the early 2000s, the tobacco guys became alarmed about the food guys. And they actually warned them privately that you're going to have as much trouble over salt, sugar, fat, literally citing those additives, and obesity as we are over like smoking and cancer. And you've got to like do something to reduce your dependency, or we're all going to get in trouble. Well, by the mid-2000s, Philip Morris had actually bailed on the food industry and sold its interest in those companies, I think in part because of that alarm about where the processed food industry was going. The tech side, we see something different now. We see this phenomenon of like tech food, the meatless burger, right? The something or other made with pea flour instead of soybeans or what have you, right? So there's a lot of folks in Silicon Valley who are trying to reinvent processed food using technology. And no doubt the big food companies are starting to acquire some of these products that look like they have the biggest chance